Um, Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Terumos Perek Beis Halacha Aleph. We're learning today Daf Yutes. We left off on Daf Yutes Amud Aleph Mamish on the top, and let's quickly review and bring us up to par. In the Mishnah, we had the Tanakama. We're going to now refer to that either as the Tanakama or the Chachamim, and we spent a lot of time learning about the rule that Ein Toirmin Min HaTohor Al HaTameh, even though you would have thought that you could, but you can't. And we began yesterday to quote the Mishnah's Rabbi Eliezer, who says that yes, Toirmin Min HaTohor Al HaTameh. That's all we had in the Mishnah. What we had on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis is a Braisa. The Braisa quotes another Tana called Rab Li'ai, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's Lamed Ayin Aleph Yud Yud. All of these Tanoim, to my recollection, we don't have them that much in the Bavli, if at all. Rab Eliai yesterday and the Chachamim today will limit the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says that yes, Toirmin Min HaTohor Al HaTameh. So we began by saying the following. Rabbi Eliai says that when Rabbi Eliezer says that you could give Truma Min HaTohor Al HaTameh, that's only Balach. And the way Rabbi Eliai understands Lach is that Lach means produce that's moist, not liquids. Normally Lach means liquids, not over here. And it was very logical what we said yesterday. In other words, the reason, let's go all with the Rash, with Rabbeinu Shimshon, that the Chachamim's opinion that Ein Toirmin Min HaTohor Al HaTameh is a Derabanan. And it's because of the rule that Truma has to be given Min HaMukav. And even though we learned yesterday that Min HaMukav doesn't demand for the two different piles to touch each other, but in most cases they will. You're going to bring them in close proximity. We never want for Truma to spread, certainly not in the Holy Land, which means if produce is tamei, we don't want for it to make other foods tamei. We don't want for a person who's tamei to make produce tamei, even if the produce is chulin, even though there's nothing wrong with chulin becoming tamei. Nevertheless, we want ideally for chulin also to be eaten betara. So that was the logic of the Chachamim. And that would be the logic of Rabbi Eliai's understanding of Rabbi Eliezer. Moist produce, this is a fact. People handle food that's dry a lot quicker than people handling moist food with their hands. They don't do that. In most cases, if the food is moist, they put it in a keli. So since when food is anyways in a keli, it's possible to bring foods together, even touching, but creating, let's call this a halachic bridge, which will not allow the tuma from one to go into the other. The example that we gave yesterday is if a person has olives, and it's more than just an example because it only fits because of the size of an olive. I know there are many other foods that have that size or less. The key is, all according to Rabbi Liai, is that when foods are smaller than the share of a kibetza, and they are tamei, tevel, you can take the same type of food. The case was olives. They're all moist. They're anyways in a keli. You're not touching them. If the point of contact is minimal, even though the few olives in the tahor keli will touch the olives in the tamei keli, and they can become tamei, even if they become tamei, they won't continue to pass the tuma forward.
Are they in two separate kelis?
Yeah, they're two sets of kelis.
How do they touch each other?
We're in a barrel in the bottom.
How do the olives touch each other? The kelis are separate.
I want to go into, there's so much more to this because really olives in the bottom are not the kibetza. They cannot even impart to the two olives in the mouth of the funnel. It's more about the liquid. We have to, I don't want to go right now over these rules, but midarabanan, liquid, even if liquid has contact with a sheni, it goes back to be a rishon. And then that liquid that touches other liquids will make the other liquids a rishon. The case there is that the olives in the bottom are moist. So the liquid will make whatever it touches tamei. Okay, the olives in the top are not moist, in my understanding. If the olives in the top would be very moist, then the liquids in the bottom barrel would make all of the olives in the top barrel tamei because the moisture would make everything tamei. The bottom one is moist, so the bottom one could impart tumah, but the olives in the top are not moist, and they're only olives. So even though the ones that touch the bottom ones will become tamei, even though the ones that touch the liquid in the bottom will become tamei, but since they are only olives, they cannot further the olive. So the 99% of the olives in the top keli remains tahar. So the advantage of giving to a kohen truma tahira outflanks, overrides, trumps the issue of having one or two olives becoming tamei. That was what Rabbi like. That was yesterday. Now, today we're going to begin, and we're going to spend some time in explaining the Chachamim's understanding of Rabbi Eliezer. That's all on top of Daf Yutes. They actually understand lach to mean what it normally means, liquids. They even limit more Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, that the only time that you can be toidim min hatoir ala tamei is only liquids for liquids. If you have liquids that are toir and liquids that are tamei, there you could. Problem is, Aviv, liquids, we just mentioned that if liquids that are tamei touch liquids that are toir, all of it becomes tamei. How does he avoid that? How is it even possible to be toirem min hatoir ala tamei by liquids without contact? Now, whoever learned yesterday is going to right away say, simple. We learned yesterday on Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph that if you have a base Chabad, that means if you have either a area designated to be an olive press or really an area designated to be a wine press, even though there are many vats in the same room, even if we're going to say bias means a room, it's already min hamukav. You don't have to have contact. Based on that, it's simple. The fact that our Gemara does not give that as a solution, we have to go through more sophisticated solutions. All of that, before we begin even, you can already take a look on Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph. I just chop something. On Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph, in the second to last line, when we learned the Braisa that says, Kol Beis Hagitois Echad, if you're going to look inside the Shinu Nuschois, hey, he writes that the Rashid Ilyo deletes that line. And he deletes that line because of today. The fact that we don't give this as a solution must be, that so says the Rashid Ilyo, that there is no such a thing that if you have two vats of liquids in the same room, that they are considered min hamukav. We don't say that. We do. We have yesterday the keli with vegetables. That we say it combines. As long as there's nothing intervening. That works. If you have a threshing floor and on the threshing floor various piles, that is min hamukav. But having vats that are completely separated, right? Storing oil, storing wine, they're not combined. But we're going to figure out how to make it min hamukaf, how not to impart tuma. After we're going to clarify Shitas Chacham, I'm going to quickly just go over today's daf by heart. The Gemara is going to wonder, who do we paskin like? Like the Tanakama of our Mishnah, Ein toidemin min hatoir al artamei, or do we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer that yes, toidemin min hatoir al artamei? And after going through that, we're going to move on Daf Yud Tes Amud Beis to the next topic in the Mishnah. We're going back to Halacha Aleph. The next topic is Ein toidemin min hatamei al hatoir. Now that's much worse, right? Because if you're giving to the kohen tamei for tar, he's really losing out. You're really giving him min hara al hayafa. And what happens if you did it? The Mishnah says, shoygig mezid. If b'shoygig, truma say truma. If you did it b'mezid, ain't loy asav loy klum. Loy asav loy klum. What we're going to have today, and we're going to have to leave it at cliffhanger, just push it, not it doesn't go, is that we're going to quote the last Mishnah in Tvul Yom. And because of it being late, and I'm so excited about today's daf, I'll share what the Mishnah says there when we get there. We're going to have a Mishnah in Tvul Yom. We're going to have a big discussion about Tvul Yom. And when you learn it, you're going to wonder, how does it fall into Masechtas Trumas? Only tomorrow, at the end of the discussion, we'll begin, God willing, tomorrow by pointing out that discussion at the end will pose a huge kasha on our Mishnah that says, Ein toidemin min hatamei al hatamei. Shoygig mezid. Huge. But we're not going to get to the end. We're just going to open it up and we're going to jump over to Tvul Yom. Daf Yud Tes Amud Aleph. Again, we're now back to Rabbi Eliezer says that yes, toidemin min hatoir al hatamei. We're not debating Rabbi Eliezer, who has a tradition that Rabbi Eliezer only said it balach. We're not debating that. But we are debating the understanding of Rabbi Eliezer that applied the lach to moist produce. Says Amruloi, this is a continuation in the Braisa. The Chachamim tell Rabbi Eliezer, all beshitas Rabbi Eliezer, ein lecha korui lach elo shemen yayin v'shemen bilvad. When Rabbi Eliezer says toirim min atoir alatame, exactly. When Rabbi Eliezer only said it belach, exactly, we agree with that. But you gave a whole Torah explaining that it's moist food, and the whole Torah we just repeated and we had yesterday. It can't be that because the lach means lach. Look inside the top Mahara folder, the second one, but on the top of the Amid. Ein locha kori ela yain v'shemen v'loy zeisim. He was not talking about zeisim af shehem kavushim b'tzid, even though you explained that the tamei zeisim in the bottom barrel, they were being pickled and therefore moistened by tzid, whether it's vinegar or whatever they put it in, fish brine. That's not called lach. That will also be called yavesh biyavesh. Even Rabbi Eliezer agrees that by yavesh biyavesh mishum gezeres the mukav sheikir agzere biyavesh hoysa v'zeh nami nechshav li yavesh. And I'll tell you behigoyen. Can I tell you something behigoyen aside of the meaning, the semantic of lach? Even what we explained yesterday, at the end of the day, we acknowledged that the few olives that are in the top funnel, that are tahor, that will touch the bottom barrel, that's tamei, those olives will become tamei. So we don't want that. We don't want for not a single added food that was tahor to become tamei. So we reject that understanding of. He only said it lach b'lach. When you have lach and lach, liquid and liquid, there you could do min hamukef, aviv, without making any of it tamei. Now the question is, it's much worse now. Lach b'lach, if they touch with a millimeter, if one is tamei, all of the other is tamei. All of it is tamei. So how do you do that? That's the Gemara's kasha. Hey chavidam. And like we said, there's no nuance that even if the liquid is tummy on the level of a sheni, it doesn't work that way. Liquids, they go back to tchila. They become a rishon. Everything will become a rishon. So to explain that, to explain the shitas chachamim, Rabbi Eliezer, the Gemara quotes another brayso, another tosefta, and we're going to say that it's only in those cases. What are those cases? So case number one, when you have one beam that's being used, very good, Gavaldic picture. There's one beam that is being used for two boiros. We're speaking here about oil, and the same thing will be for grapes, same thing, but we're going to go about oil. So even though oil in one boir is separated from the oil in the other boir, we will consider it min hamukaf if there is the same beam that is used to press one is used to press the other. Number one, that's called min hamukaf. And again, like we spoke about in the intro, I had such a hard time yesterday. I was learning this. I was wondering, why didn't we just quote the Braisa yesterday that when you have vats in the same room, the room combines them. That Asherilio therefore says that's not that we delete that. We don't have that girsa. The Gemara over here doesn't accept such an opinion, doesn't even know there is such an opinion. Perhaps there is no such an opinion. Option number two, shnei koiros lebayr echad. That gets more complicated. If you have two beams that are being used for the same boir, two beams for the same boir, which right away won't make sense. Who cares if there's two beams to the same boir? How is it possible to have in one boir shem and toir and shem and tamei? Doesn't work. That's the whole issue. So the Gemara right away interrupts. What are you talking about? Nicha, I get the first case of this new braisa, that when you have one beam that's used, even though it's being used for two different boiros, halachically we say since they were pressed by the same beam, they're considered mukaf the whole time. They're considered the same. They're considered connected. But shnei koiros lebayr echad, who cares if you're using a different beam for the tamei, and then when you're doing the tar, you're using a separate beam. Who cares? If they're going into the same board, they all will become tamei. And everyone is agreeing that we are avoiding making the tahor tamei. So to clarify the second case in the Braisa, says the Gemara, Rebbelah, B'Shem Rebbe Lazar, Tiftoid, interpreted, this is what happened. That you were planning, you have one beam. You had different groups of olives. Some were tamei, some were tar. Initially, you were not concerned about the fact that you're going to have oil that's tar or that's tamei. You were planning to press it all in one pit, in one cistern. You were going to be using the same utensils. That kavana that you had initially keeps them combined, even if de facto you decided at the end, you know what? I'm going to put it in separate boides. The nimlach lasoisoi shnei tevusois. Gewaldig. Now, another important nuance over here. What happened here is that initially everything was tahar. You were planning to do everything in one pit. That's the way we're going to learn it over here. At the end, you decided to keep some in one pit and some in the other boy, cistern, however they call it, vat. After they were in two separate vats, one of them became tamei. That's the way that Rashi Ilio explains the scenario. Here we say that since the owner, the balabas, initially planned to press it all in the same vat, and he adds, and since initially everything was pure, so halachically you were able to do it without creating tumah, even though at the end you decided to separate them, your machshava that you had to keep them united initially keeps it enough min hamukaf. Amazing. Yesterday, for those of us who learned the Rambam, the last chapter yesterday was all about machshava, right? The three machshavas that are poiselas by korbanos, shinei Hashem, shinei makom, shinei zman, machshava makom. The concept of kavana. In other words, only in the scenario where for some reason two vats are considered connected, min hamukaf, only there did Rabbi Eliezer say that you can betray them from one on the other because you do not have to have any contact. There will be no imparting of any tumah. That's why he says you can do it. Okay. Now, Keminag Yerushalmi, the Gemara stops over here, but the next step of the Gemara demands for you to know that after the Braisa, that the Gemara quoted the words, gave you the two scenarios where you can have two vats of oil, that they will be considered min hamukaf, even though they are in two separate vats. And even though now one is tamei and one is tar, the Braisa goes on to say that the same thing is with grapes and with wine. And that's going back to the lach. So that's why when he said in the beginning, when the Chachamim say that ein locha kori lach el yayin v'shemen, the Braisa actually speaks out both the shemen and the yayin. Now, when it comes to the yayin, there is another thing you have to hold in your mind. So says the Gemara, Omar Rabbi Yosi Berabun, that's an amoira, referring to the part of the Braisa that the Gemara doesn't even quote, that applies the same rule to wine. Hadod the Tamar, you can only apply to the case of the wine only when it became tamei after Misha Shila or Misha Kippah. Now, what does that mean? So when you make wine, like when you make any other product, the obligation of tithing only kicks in when it's considered a completed item. We just learned about it a lot, right? 2 weeks ago. What's the completed product by oil? When it's in the vat. By the wine, it's not called completed when it's in the vat. It's not enough. Because even though they had systems that would strain out some of the residue, some of the shemarim, some of the pits, some of the klipas, some of it made it all the way down to the bottom vat. And we have Gabriel with us that can confirm it. I don't know how it works today. And only during its fermenting, I don't know for how many days, at some point during the fermenting, all of the impurities, they rise to the top of the bottom vat, and the balabas, the winemaker, removes them. Prior to which, it's really considered of an inferior quality, or even better, it's not a completed product. What we are going for is that when you have wine in two different vats, or oil in two different vats, and we're saying that just because you intended to put it in the same vat, that makes it min hamukaf, all of that only works if they were both tahar when the obligation of tithing them was chal, took hold. So by the oil, it's simple. The oil, you ended up putting a little bit of oil in one vat and a little bit of oil in another vat. You ended up doing that. For one moment, even when they were chayiv to be tied, they were tar. Here, Rabbi Eliezer says that if one became tamei, no, it's connected to the other one. What made them connected? Not only because you intended to put it in the same vat, because halachically they could have gone in the same vat because all of them were tar. We have to say the same thing with the wine. There needed to be first a point where both vats had tahared wine. But here we have to add another detail, because if when it went into the vat A and then it went into the vat B, if prior to you doing this shila and kippah, before you remove the residues, that takes a few days to raise to the top, if before that happened, one of them became tamei, then it became tamei before there was a chiyuv, before there was a chalois chiyuv to be toidim. If from when the chiyuv kicked in, one was toid and one was tamei, it's never called min hamukav, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, and you cannot be toid min atoid ala tamei. In other words, it has to be shekfar niru litoidman b'taharo. We need for both of them to have had a moment at least. That's a great picture in which both of them were chayiv to have tithings removed from it, and they were both still tahar. Now, if one became tamei, now we still call it min hamukav. Avalim nitma acheloi shila va'acheloi kippah. He's teaching that shila goes to the seeds and kippah goes to the skins. What we're speaking about not only wasn't in the vat, but if it became tamei prior to doing this final step, which makes it a gemar melacha, loy bidah. We won't say it's called min hamukav. We won't say that since you intended to put it in the same vat, it's considered connected. We don't say that. Okay, Gavaldi. So it's amazing how the Chachamim that we learned today really limit the leniency of Rabbi Eliezer. It's not only Balach, it's Balach only in these two scenarios where they are considered united, min hamukav. Okay, or just to add, if we're going to go back to Daf Yud Ches yesterday, and we're not going to take out the girsa that the Rashi Ilio says you take out, if you're going to leave it in the Braisa, then it's easier to apply Rabbi Eliezer, because any two vats that's in the same base Habad is considered min hamukav, then amachaya. Okay, now who do we paskin like? So says the Gemara that it was 2 against 2, and that's very important. That this is a good klal of even how you paskin. We're going to learn 2 good rules. First good rule is that you want to know how many people side with one, how many amoyroim sided with the other, right? No one is debating with Tanoim. And whenever it's going to be 2 and 2, you're stuck, which is what we're going to begin with. So first, the Gemara lets you know that Rab Tavi, really you have to add in the name of Rabbi Yoshia, Rabbi Yanai. So that's 1. Says halacha ki Rabbi Eliezer, that in the case of lach, however you understand lach, you could be toidim min hatoid ala tamei. 1. Number 2, Rav Yitzchak bar Nachman, b'shem Rabbi Yoshaya, also halacha ki Rabbi Eliezer. 2, like Rabbi Eliezer, more lenient. On the other side, Rav Huna, in the name of Rab Chananya, ein halacha ki Rabbi Eliezer. Number 1. Number 2, Rabbi Yosi berabun, again, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda b'shem Shmuel, also ein halacha ki Rabbi Eliezer. Even though it's Rabbi Yosi b'shem Rabbi Yehuda b'shem Shmuel, it's still considered 1. It's all coming from 1. So 2 against 2. And therefore, the end of the Amid, also, Uvda, Komei Rav Imi, and they asked Rav Imi, could you be Toira min HaToira ala Tomei? And he didn't want to give up Psak Din. He didn't know how to paskin, and he explained why. He said, I don't know what to say. Why? He said, Terein, Kol Kiveil, Terein Inun, because it's 2 against 2. Look inside the bottom of our folder. Lefisha Amar, the Havali Shnaim Ha'oisrim, Keneged Shnaim Ha'matirim. In other words, he's trying. Rav Imi was basically teaching us that when you learn Gemara, and after you have a machlokas in the Mishnah, you have the Gemara quoting different people siding with different Tanoim, numbers matter. I'll tell you even better. Go to any Beis Din. What's the rule in a Beis Din? If you have different opinions, Achri Rabim Lahatois, in the same Beis Din, you follow the majority. So when more people side with one, we paskin like that. That's what that, in other words, Rav Imi was not telling us how to paskin in the case that came to him, but he's telling us a gavaldik way of how to paskin. And on this, there's a nuance, and I think that's very important. Daf Yotes Amud Beis. The nuance is not, if some of the two are greater than the other. That's the whole problem that we have is, they're greater Rav. No. It's not about the Gedolim and the Ketanim. Here's very important. There's a huge difference whether an Amoira, Aviv, while he was giving a shir, said during a class, Halacha ke Rabbi Eliezer, that has lesser weight in comparison to someone who actually paskined a case that came before him. When you paskin a case that comes before you, that has a lot more weight. And therefore, asks the Gemara that from the two that sided with Rabbi Eliezer, one of them, the second one that we had on Daf Yutes Amud Aleph, was Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachman. Problem is that Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachman opined not like the others when they were learning in the Beis HaMedrash. He gave his opinion when there was an actual case in front of him. For Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachman, hoire, look inside the top marafulda, that kishmaitze, and that's called what he calls the marafulda maiserav. Maiserav means not, they're having a discussion theoretically. Maiserav is a halacha l'mais. I can tell you one thing interesting, that in the Litvische world, for sure, the Aruch HaShulchan, who was a Rav in Germany, right? First of all, in everyone, in the world of Lubavitch, everyone has the Aruch HaShulchan. My father told me to get the Aruch HaShulchan. He was a big Rav. And I know from current Paiskim that if there is a machlokes between the Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan, they paskin like the Aruch HaShulchan. And that's a big thing, because the Mishnah Berurah should be the final, the Basra. But the Mishnah Berurah wrote the Mishnah Berurah not paskening dinim. He wrote it as a sefer in halacha. The Aruch HaShulchan recorded shailas that came in front of him. That's the way it works. That has a lot more weight. Because these people, they had a lot of siyata d'shmaya when a case came to them. And if they paskin one way, it's almost like, not that we paskin from the heavens. It's like God is paskening that way. So now the Gemara says that even though Rav Imi heard that statement, or even though he knew about that, loy hoire, for whatever reason. But I love this shtickle Gemara. So first of all, numbers count. And on top of that, it's not just numbers. You have to know in what context did they give their opinion. And there's nothing like what the Marafulda calls Maiserav. It didn't work out that way. It doesn't matter. That's an exception for whatever reason. Okay. And now we begin a whole new journey that will begin today and will continue tomorrow. And here I want to speak now the words of introduction. All of this fits based on the Rash Cirilio. This is important. That deletes from the Braisa we had on Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph those lines that say that kol beis gitois echad. We don't accept this today. The whole daf today goes without it. You have to have min hamukov. Let me go now to wine. That's the topic of Tful Yom. Here's Gabriel. How exactly do you separate truma from the vat of wine? Wine that you already removed the seeds, you removed the residue, it's your chayiv, it's a gemar malacha. Let me tell you how they did it. They put a basket down into that vat. Aviv, pay attention. They approximated the 2% in the basket, and that's fine. Approximation is perfect. While the basket was still in the vat, but it's above the wine on the bottom. There's wine in the bucket, not basket. In the bucket, then they would declare that this is truma. That is the point. That's the moment that they would be kodesh shem truma. You understand why they have to do it? Because of what we're learning. It's called min hamukov. Before you separate it, it's in there. If they were to remove the bucket and place it away from the remaining and only then declare it truma, you're lacking min hamukov. To fulfill the min hamukov, you're making a hafrasha. You're leaving it inside. It's still above the bottom wine. It's easy to picture it. And you're making a declaration. That's step number one. This allows for two potential problems to come up. Problem number one. What were to happen if the shlamazel who did it somehow dropped it? And after you were kodesh shem truma, Gabriel is laughing because he can see it happening. It goes back in. What now will happen? Now you're going to have dimua. And again, don't forget that the ratio of bittul is 100 to 1. How much is truma gedola? Aviv, wake up, you need coffee. 2%. That means that if the truma falls back into the vat, you don't have bittul. There's a big loss. So there's one, that's problem number one. Another type of potential problem number two. If for whatever reason, the truma in the bucket becomes tamei, aside of the fact that the kohen now, Nebuch, is going to get truma tameya, if it falls back in, that truma, like we learned today, again, liquid, that truma will make everything tamei. So what's the solution? You can say the solution is make sure you don't drop the bucket in. There is another solution. And now we're going back mamish to the beginning of this whole Masechta. When we began in the beginning to say that truma is a certain form of a neder. That's why this whole thing of a mufla hasamach lo'ish. Remember that whole topic that maybe he can be toidem. Rabbi Yossi says that if you can make a neder, he can separate truma. It's like a neder also because there is a possibility by truma to retroactively annul the truma, like by a neder, without doing hataras nedarim. In our case of tful yom, if the person who's being toidem the truma from the vat of wine were to say explicitly that I am removing the truma al tanai on the condition that it doesn't fall back in. Because if it's going to fall back in, it's going to make it dimua, or it's going to make it tamei. If that were to happen, if it falls back in, listen, I retroactively nullify my hafrasha of truma, which means that which I removed is tevel. Everything is tevel. Now, how does that resolve dimua? We understand. How does it resolve dimua? Because it's not truma and chulin, it's tevel. You can just separate again. How does it resolve tuma? Here are the key words. The type of tuma that was found in a wine press, of course, you can have a person that's tamei on a higher level of tuma. Those people never entered wine presses. They were not allowed in. The only regular tumah mitzuya in a wine press is a person who's a tful yom. Let's quickly review the dinim. A tful yom is someone aviv. It doesn't matter how tamei he was, but he's at the end of the process of his purification. He already went to the mikvah. Elama, it's not yet dark. It's not say sakir chava. And we have, so midoyiraisa, that's a very important question. Aviv asked, is he tamei? The right words is that on one hand, uba b'mayim, I forgot the psukim, he goes into the water and he's tar. He's called in the Torah tar, which is why he who touches chulin, even if he has contact with meiser sheni, he will not make that tamei. But there's a vestige of tuma. If you want to put a number on it, on the level of a sheni, and if he were to have contact with either truma or kachim, he would make that into a shlishi. Only. A tful yoim would be the only person that's found in a wine press. Because if not for truma, without looking at the truma there, which might be there, there's no damage he can do. He has to wait until the evening. Until then, if he touches truma, it makes a tummy. Now it makes sense. If the guy made a tanai that if the bucket of truma falls back in, retroactively it's nullified, that resolves truma. Why? Because if retroactively it's not truma, it's chulin. Chulin never became tamei because a tful yoim cannot be metamei chulin. How great is that? All of this is before the Mishnah. We're learning actually the last Mishnah in tful yoim. The Mishnah begins to address a person who, when he made that condition, did not specify both of these problems. If he were to say that if I separate truma and it falls back in, to avoid the problem of dimua, I'm retroactively going to nullify the truma. And then he also would have said, and if it becomes tamei, forget about falling back in, just becomes tamei. I don't want the kohen to get truma tameya. I'm retroactively nullifying my designation of truma. If he were to say that, it would work. What happens if a person doesn't specify what issue is he addressing? Do we automatically say that as long as he made mention of if there's a problem, I want my truma to be from the outset not truma? Does it address both problems, or do we not say that? Two opinions, two Tanoim, and then we're going to learn a third Tana that says even if he says nothing, there's a Tanai based in. It's self-understood that he made such a Tanai, even though he never articulated it. That's the Mishnah. Let's begin. Now, you ask, what does that have to do with our Mishnah? You'll see. We'll have to wait until tomorrow. But what part of the Mishnah are we bringing all this in? When the Mishnah says, Vaiter, that ein toidim min hatomei al hatoir, which makes a lot of sense. Because if you're toidim min hatomei al hatoir, you're giving the kohen mamish min hara ala yofe. You can't do that. But if you did it, again, shoygig, truma se truma, mezid, loy asa v'loy klum. We already said we'll have to explain those words. Not ein truma se truma. Loy asa v'loy klum. We'll get there. But first, let's go. Tamon taninan. We learned in the final Mishnah in Mesechtas Tful Yom that hatoidim min haboid. When a person separates truma from this wine, from this vat, and again, prior to this Mishnah, this person specified the Tanai, addressing explicitly both issues, dimua and tuma. Here, va'amar, all he said was harezu truma. He said the words almanas. He made a stipulation. He made a Tanai. But listen to his words. Almanas shetala b'shalim. As long as everything is b'shalom or b'shalva. Hareyat nikodeshes li almanas. That'll be shalom. Go try that. Okay, that's up to you. That's not a Tanai. So now, what does he mean? Says the Tanakama, that generic statement does not address the Tuma, which according to the Tanakama is much less likely, and things that are much less likely are things that you did not have in your mind unless we know you had it in your mind because you said so. So it does address Shalom and Hashever, Shalom and Hashvicha. Shever and Shvicha is the same issue. Shalom and Shvicha is both what were to happen because of Min HaMukav. You separated the Truma when it's still in the vat. It's still in the vat. It's just above it. It's in the bucket. Either what could happen is that the bucket will break or the rope will break. If the rope break, what happens? The whole bucket falls back in. Shvicha means even if the rope doesn't break, you have trembling hands. You're schlepping it up. It begins to go back and forth, and some of it spills back in. It's both Shever and Shvicha is both the issue of after you separated Truma, it's going to go back into the pit. You're going to make Dimua. But that's the key of the Tanakama. Aboloi min hatuma. It does not, by default, work if what's in the bucket becomes Tameh, for you to say, the guy made a stipulation that if it becomes Tameh, right away it reverts back to Tevel, and therefore, like we explained, and therefore there's no Tuma, because the only Tuma possible B'chal is of a Tvul Yoim, and now you get to separate it again. Unless you say it explicitly, it does not address the Tuma issue. Tanakama. Second opinion is Rab Shimon, which is Rab Shimon Bar Yochai. Rab Shimon Oimer, Af min Tuma. No. Now, before we go on, like we mentioned, to the third opinion, which is the sheet of Rabbi Yossi, the Tana Rabbi Yossi, before we go on, the Gemara right away clarifies, like I mentioned, like if it becomes Tameh, how does the stipulation help? And Bachlal, it's so uncommon. Tuma, people were so careful not to make their wine Tameh. Like, why would the Rab Shimon say that even though we don't know that what he had in mind, he made a very generic statement. Why does it go to Tuma? So for that, Amar Rabbi Yossi ben Rab Chanina, that the whole issue, betumas tful yoim hi masnisa. This is according to everyone. The whole topic over here is not, listen, if chulin becomes tamei, it means, let's say someone is an av, right? Someone like we're an av, we don't have, we're tamei mace. If we touch tevel, we make the tevel tamei. If we touch wine, we make the wine tamei. It won't even help to make a tanai. We're not talking about that. That's the whole beauty. We're only talking about the level of a tful yoim. Like we said, a tful yoim has a level of a sheni. Sheni doesn't even make Meiser Sheni into a Tameh. That was the Chagiga, right? What's the cutoff line? The Tful Yoim, it only has the power to make Truma or Kachem or Mechatos. But nothing less than that. Okay. And on that, Amar Rabila, he's explaining Rab Shimon. Now that we know that this whole Tuma and the resolution of Tuma by having a retroactive nullification of a Truma is only regarding a Tuma that comes from a Tful Yoim. If it was never Truma, there was never Tuma. Now Rab Shimon makes sense. Shekain Tful Yoim Matsuim Ben Agitos. Exactly. Other Tamei people would never be there. It's mamash adavar shalei matzoi. Rab Shimon never would have said that if we don't know that he said it explicitly, it applies to something that's mamish not common. But it is common. Tfula yoim would go to the base hagas, to the. Because, in other words, why would it not be common? People know that if I have a tuma issue, I don't belong there. If my tuma issue is not a problem for a wine press, if I'm a tful yoim, other than truma, there is no issue. A tful yoim, like someone who's tummy on the level of a sheni. I'll give you another big rule. Nowadays, right, chachamim, our hands have a din of a sheni. A kohen is worried with truma. We're not worried about it at all. It's only once a year, right, that we wash our hands over there by the seder before we have the karpas. Normally, there's no issue. We can't be metame. We could be metame, like I mentioned, again, the third time today, that made the rabban and all, my hands are a sheni. If I touch food that is wetted, since a sheni will make liquid, not just tame, but tchila, rishon. So if I touch chulin, apple that's wet, just an example, the water becomes a rishon, and the apple becomes a sheni, and a chanami. Again, that's the whole reason why we wash our hands by the karpas. But coming back over here, yes.
Just a quick question. Is the idea that the stipulation that the guy makes, it's just what someone generally would include, and therefore that's what you're allowed to include? Can I say, hey, I'm making a stipulation to include every scenario, even someone that's whatever.
So Danny, so very good. That's very good. Exactly. So Nachamo, if the person is explicit in what the Tanai is for, it works. The last Mishnah, Tful Yoim, these were his words. Almanas shatale b'shalom. Everything should come out well. Shalom, not peace. Shalom means shlemus. Everything should be good, should be completed.
Hey,
what does that mean? So that's the whole thing. Since the whole issue is Tful Yoim, that's why it makes sense that even though the issue of Tful Yoim is definitely, let's say, Aviv, lesser of an issue than spillage. Spillage is common. Nevertheless, that's his word that Rab Shimon says Tful Yoim is Mitzuin ben Hagitos. Now, Amar Rabbi Yosi, exactly, this is all explaining because of the rule, like we just spoke out, that Ein L'Tful Yoim Maga Eitzel Tevel, Gavaldik. You can't make Tevel tummy. Now, there's a third opinion. What's the third opinion? The third opinion is, again, the Gemara is so mekatzed, and that's the Tana Rabbi Yosi, who says that even if the person did not say the words Almanas Shetala B'Shalom, every time you're toidim wine from a wine press, when you put it in the bucket, before you remove the bucket from the vat, there is a Tanai Bezdin, as if you made a stipulation. That's how lenient he is. It's automatic that if there is any issue, either with Tuma or with spillage, it's retroactively nish Truma. Now, that's Rabbi Yosi. The Gemara doesn't even quote it. Now, at least we're going to limit Rabbi Yosi. This is Gavaldik. Remember this for tomorrow. Now, we learned in a Braisa that says the Tana Rabbi Yudan regarding Shitas Rabbi Yosi, that there is a Tanai Bezdin, you don't have to say a word. It's Rab Shimon plus. Automatically, everything is covered. Only by Truma Gedoyla. Because you had no option other than to declare it Truma when the bucket is in the vat. Why? Because of Ben Hamukaf. Shahid tzricha litra min Hamukaf. So therefore, what option did you have? And you know that there is a possibility that things will really go south. So the Beis Din worked it out for you without you having to make any extra effort because you did what you needed to do. When a person does not do what they need to do, when a person is lazy, when a person does something that's not necessary, Beis Din doesn't try to work things out for him. Avol betrumas meiser, that we learned, again, beautiful, again, trumas meiser does not need to be given in amukov. So if there is a vat of meiser addition, and you are separating from it exactly 10% to give it to the Levi, you do not have to declare that, trumas meiser, you're declaring from that, trumas meiser, to give to the kohen. You don't have to declare it min amukov. Who asked you to make a declaration when the bucket is in the vat and now you have spillage and now you have issues? Avol betrumas meiser, afilu sha'ar kol hadvarim shalom heim, which means You have the best option of shalom. You know what? If you would be concerned about problems, you know what you would have done? You would have removed the bucket from the vat, and then you would have declared it Trumas Meiser. You didn't do it. I don't know what you have in mind. Maybe you're a risk taker. Maybe you're a person that doesn't have foresight. You're impulsive. You rush things. There's no Tanai Beis Din for you. Even Rabbi Yossi will say there's no Tanai Beis Din. We're not done yet. Look how many steps you have to chop until we come back to the Mishnah. Now we have another detail. Says the Gemara, what happens if the owner is separating Truma Gedoyla and Trumas Meiser at the same time? Don't jump, because we already learned, even if it's a B'di'evid, that I, the Yisrael owner, I am allowed B'di'evid to also separate the 1% that the Levi would have separated from his Meiserishin, which would mean, how much would I separate? If I do it together, Truma Gedoyla and Trumas Meiser, what percent would I separate? 3%. Avo, ho, you told him both. Truma, Trumas Meiser ka'achas, says the Braisa, Eino Shalom. Eino Shalom, which means, since I have to separate it when the bucket is in the vat, there is no better option. I'm doing it the best possible. That's the meaning. So the Tanai Beis Din already kicks in according to Rabbi Yossi. So far, so good. We're going to learn one more step. Now I have a kasha on that. You know what my kasha is? I understand that Truma Gedoyla, Min HaMukav, has to be designated when the bucket is in the vat. Okay, so we have Tanai Beis Din. But Trumas Meiser didn't have to be that way. So if I do it together, why are we saying that all of it is included in the Tanai Beis Din? Why wouldn't we say, okay, listen, for the 2% of Truma Gedoyla, you have a Tanai Beis Din, but for the 1% Meiserishin, there's no Tanai Beis Din. Why don't we say that? That's the final thing we'll learn today. And for that, the Gemara explains that Yehuda Biribi, Biribi means the Chacham. The wise Rabbi Yehuda said, I'll tell you why. Because, Aviv, think about it. If the Truma Gedoyla, the stipulation does what? It nullifies the Truma Gedoyla retroactively. If that would not apply to the Trumas Meiser, what would happen de facto? This person removed Trumas Meiser before Truma Gedoyla. You're not allowed to do that. There is a law for a person to separate the tithings out of order. And it's a given that a person doesn't want to violate separating the tithings out of order. Also, which would be, if the Tanai Beis Din would only go for the Truma Gedoyla and not for the Trumas Meiser, lahagdem Trumas Meiser la Truma Gedoyla. I hope we can really remember this. And therefore, if you're doing it all together, Rabbi Yossi's Tanai Beis Din does go into play. The bottom line that we're going to squeeze out for God willing tomorrow is that since a person does not want to be oved al divrei Torah, there'll be times that we will retroactively nullify his designation for there not to be a violation. We're retroactively putting a Tanai on the Trumas Meiser for there not to be a violation. That all of this will pose a bomb question on our Mishnah. When you're going to hear the question, you're not going to find the solution. It'll be so gavaldik takash. But you need to remember all of these steps, and we'll do the best we could to be to chazer, and it's really late, and God willing.